Sam Long. I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast, because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We are in the throes of getting ready for all of our students to be back on campus. Last minute preparations of things going on. There was mulch put down yesterday. There was a lot of mowing going on. You may hear some mowing in the background. There's
a little bit in the background there.
There's a special friend out our window mowing.
I think it's just an effort to be mentioned on the air again.
Right.
Well, it's funny because it's Greg Stauffer who was out there on the lawnmower, and we were joking about it, that evidently he hasn't done his job well enough, so he's been demoted from VP down to maintenance guy.
If we don't reach our enrollment goals, you're mowing the lawn.
That's right.
Well, like I said, tells us where our goals are.
Although I don't know, for me that wouldn't be so much of a demotion because, like, you just put in your earbuds, you're mowing, listening to music or podcast.
Drinking your margarita. Just kidding. Probably not.
I was going to say I don't see a cup holder on there, so.
Yeah. But I think the reason is, I know the reason. So he's been working to add some fun features to the campus, like bowling,
right.
which is bowling with a football,
yep.
And then also working on the volleyball court. So he told them specifically, don't mow this yesterday, I think, when they were planning on it. So I think if you put them off their schedule, you've got to compensate.
Yeah. Okay, yesterday was a campus work day, and Greg was creating a football bowling game right along the building. Mm-hmm. I think that's actually what happened. His enrollment number is actually looking pretty good.
Right. Thanks, John.
Well, and looking out, like, I've got two different windows. One faces east, one faces south. And so in my south window, we've got the volleyball court, and he painted the post blue.
Yep.
That's.
And he wrote on the sidewalk where the folding is, he put a big GLCC. So if you're ever on a plane flying out of Lansing, maybe keep an eye out. I don't know. You might see it.
Cool.
Yeah. Speaking of Greg Stauffer, he did our first ever drop-in announcement last week.
Yes, he did.
If you're a listener who's been tracking every episode, you probably noticed for the first time in the middle of an episode, we faded and we went to a commercial. And Greg went on to talk about the value of dual enrollment. And there are lots of students who are taking AP classes so they don't have to go to college and take these classes. And, when you take AP classes, you have to, it's a whole semester long class, and you have to pass a test with a certain grade. Like you might have to get like a 3 out of 4 on the test, and if you don't get any credit.
Right.
But there's a little known way to a lot of high school guidance counselors and parents and students. If you just take a class as a dual enrolled student at a college and pass it, you automatically get credit.
Right. It's called dual because you get the high school credit and you get the college credit.
Yeah, applies to both.
Right. My son did this in his high school, so he's coming into Great Lakes almost halfway to his associates.
That's
so
amazing.
He's going to knock out his associates in the first year.
And
he's also he's taking, like, he was taking classes here that anyway, he didn't love all of his classmates at high school. So I was like, I'll just go to college and take psychology instead of taking it at high school. Anyway, so things like that. And but we have it online, so you don't have to come here. You don't have to drop out of school and do it. You could just do it separately. So
drop out of school.
And in addition, when you I'd be outside to listen to the commercial, but the benefits of it are, in addition, it's cheaper, and your high school will pay for some of it.
Yeah.
Because it's basically the same getting it for them. So a lot of win-win-wins.
Yeah, so that's why we had the drop-in last week. We didn't start a new drop-in commercial thing. We're not actually that far along.
Yeah,
in
I
the
can't wait till
process.
Harry's razor is here in the middle of our episode this time.
Right? But we did want to get that news out early enough so that people actually had a chance to enroll if they wanted to.
Right.
So we thought of it after we'd already recorded the podcast and decided, hey, let's do a drop-in. So hope you appreciate that. I think it made us look like a real podcast.
After 5 years, we actually feel like a real podcast.
Not the shirts, the drop-in commercial. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I really thought it was the cake with our logo on top.
That was something as well.
But anyway.
Took us a long time to finish off that cake. I think we ended up throwing some of it away. We had a lot of cake for our party last week.
Whatever.
Well, speaking of commercials, we are going to do a commercial today for somebody who's been helping us out for a while now, Drew Nyquist. He contacted us, talked to John, was interested in kind of taking up our game a little bit with regard to the mixing and the editing, kind of the post-production stuff. And so we're like, yeah, do it. And Drew's been he has his own business as a music producer and producing for other people. And so now that he's been doing this for a while, and you, the listener, get to hear it, and I hope that you do hear it, by the way. I really hope that the last few episodes you've been able to say, you know what? It sounds a little bit better. It sounds a little bit louder. It sounds a little bit clearer. Maybe some of the extraneous background sounds have been dealt with, although I don't think we're going to be able to edit out
You're coughing?
drag on the lawnmower. But anyway, all that is due to Drew.
If you didn't hear Greg on the lawnmower, great job, Drew.
Yeah.
Because he was literally 2 feet from me outside the window.
Yeah, right outside the wall. So yeah, Drew, if you could pull that out, that would be amazing. I don't expect you to do that. But otherwise, I think he's been doing a great job. So we just wanted to get his name out there. And if you are a person who's interested in having music recorded for anything, for a podcast, for you're doing like a student movie or whatever, or if you need editing, production kind of stuff done, he's your man. He's got a studio at home. He does this for a living. And so just Google Drew Anthony Nyquist. You can even throw in there video game music composer, Drew Anthony Nyquist, and it'll pull up his Facebook profile. There's a link to his website, or it just might pull up his website right there. But I encourage you to track him down. He's a former student. He's a graduate of Great Lakes. He's a friend of ours, friend of the podcast. And as you can tell by listening to us, he's doing an excellent job. So I just want to direct you to him and to take advantage of that resource.
Yeah, did any of you go to Promise this year?
Yes.
Yeah, so Promise is a summer camp put on by Great Lakes, and often if you've been to a church that has like this traveling show that they do, and they go to various churches, someone has purchased a box of musical curriculum, right, with the scores and the CDs and the tunes and the script all written out. Well, Great Lakes' Promise program, which we do every summer, was all Great Lakes original. Mm-hmm. So Ryan Apple, our music professor, wrote the entire, and he happens to be a poet and a writer, wrote the entire script in the play, which I thought was very phenomenal this year. And the Drew that we're talking about did the entire musical score.
Yep.
So, and there was a ton, there were a ton of videos, which he did original music score. One of our graduates, Christian Baker, also my son-in-law, he did all the videography, but Drew did all the musical scores for it. Yeah, the guy's got talent oozing out of our pores. We're proud to call him a graduate of our music program.
Yes.
He really kind of shows it off. And to me, there were 2 tests that I needed his editing to pass. It's the shower test and the lawn mowing test.
Sure. Yeah.
If I can take a shower and hear the podcast over the shower, or if I can be mowing the lawn and with earmuffs on, right, with MP3s playing, and I can hear the podcast, then I know it's much better than it used to be from a volume perspective.
Right.
And Drew has passed both of those tests. So at least from a volume perspective, he's up to that. And I can hear the voices clearly, which I had a hard time doing before.
So real talk, have you been mowing in the cold? Is that why you're wearing the earmuffs, or what's up with that?
I have to listen to something while I'm mowing.
I'm
on there too long.
Earmuffs.
What did I say?
Earmuffs.
Earmuffs. You sound like something you
They're
wear.
fuzzy little things over your ears. You a little chilly there, John?
It's not like little earbuds. It's like noise-canceling headphones. Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Earmuffs, as the kids say.
Kind of the Princess Leia kind of earbud.
You got the cat ones, don't you, John? With the cat ears on. Oh, you made my day, John.
Is this a furry thing?
Yes, you made my day, John. I'm very happy.
I wasn't going to go there,
but I could give you some fodder.
It's good times for me.
It's a good way to start the day. We're recording a little bit earlier in the day today, so we're getting a little bit of laughter in there to get our day off right.
Anyway, good job, Drew.
Yes,
Yep.
You
I
passed
agree.
both tests.
Good
Earmuffs
job.
and all.
The earmuff test and all. Yep.
I was
So what
trying
do we-
to avoid saying earbuds. And that came
Right.
out. Anyway. Okay.
What are we doing today?
We're still continuing our series
Jesus.
on violence out of Sam's mouth. And
Whoa.
I mean, violence in the Old Testament.
Oh, speaking of earbuds, I just noticed Greg now has
He switched to the good mower.
Oh, he switched to the good more, and he's got some headphones.
He's
on,
got
so.
the noise canceling.
Yeah, so he's really ready to go. He's going pro on it.
He's got bright green earmuffs.
Anyway, sorry, John.
So last week, and we're actually talking real time now.
yeah,
Last week we recorded our final episode from the Old Testament background. Mm-hmm. And I guess we wanted to open up, I at least wanted to open up to you guys. Is there anything that stuck out to you? I mean, this group of verses is one I've walked through several times, in preparation for chapters of books and stuff. And I use some of this material in the classwork. But did anything jump out to you guys as you were kind of going through that study that surprised you in terms of, I don't know, Old Testament contributions to a discussion of violence?
Yeah, I think when a lot of people talk about the Old Testament, they talk about how violent it is, and they cite various stories, especially. But I feel like when we especially went through Torah, the number of laws that pushed back against that sort of activity and that action, and where, like, yes, these stories happened, but we failed to understand, like, that's not what God wanted. It's framing it as though this is right, descriptive versus prescriptive, right?
Yeah, right.
And
exactly.
so, yes, these things happen, but the Torah keeps saying, but we need to value life. We need to value life, and just like the sort of the pushback against the stories in the laws. And so, for me, it's an important thing to keep in mind. Like, yeah, it is violent, but it just goes to show, like, people weren't living the way God wants them to live. And so we shouldn't take that as any sort of example for us, or say, well, they did in the Old Testament, so I guess we'll keep it going in the New Testament or something like that. So that's what that stands out to me, is just the force with which it says, no, this is not the way we're supposed to be living.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that you're right, Sam. So many people will go back to the passages of the Old Testament where Israel's fighting in wars or things like that, and cite that as examples of God's character and how God's people are supposed to behave. And they don't read the Old Testament closely or thoroughly or anything, because whether it's Torah, whether it's the poets, the wisdom literature, even into the prophets, how often peace is associated with God, peace is associated with wisdom and the wise person, and how much the Old Testament comments on the nature of violence. The idea that when God looked down on the earth and saw it was filled with wickedness, filled with violence, that's what prompted him to send the flood. Those kinds of things. I think that really helps us to understand God's character and to say violence is not God's default standard. It's his default disposition. That's what I was trying to find. That's not where he goes, that he hates it. If God finds himself sort of pushed into that place, he does it with regret. It's not the angry God, it's more the weeping God who's like, this is not what I wanted to do. And so I think that when you read the Old Testament closely and you read it thoroughly, you come away with a much different picture than if you read it selectively.
Yeah. It stands out to me that, lots of the Old Testament is descriptive. It's what's going on.
Right.
It's how God's people are screwing up. And of course, when they're screwing up, there's all sorts of violence. Both bloodshed and objectification of the poor, objectification of women, objectification of a slave class. There are all sorts of things Israel is doing wrong. So descriptively, you're going to find a lot of it.
Yeah.
But when you start kind of breaking down the Old Testament to where where the authors are trying to be prescriptive, to convey God's values, God's vision. When you focus on those places, it is remarkable. I think Torah, like you brought up, Sam, is a huge part. I mean, the early chapters of Genesis, 1 through 11, is kind of like the backstory to God's prescriptive mandates for his people in Torah, right? And the theme is humans are corrupt and violent, and God wants to find a way forward in a world where humans are like that.
Yeah.
Like violence, more than I think most people realize, is like the most outed problem and sin and offense of the human race.
Yeah.
And that's a biblical critique, laying it out. And then when you get into Torah, which is prescriptive, how God's people are to think about violence, how they're to think about war, how they're to think about even what you do when someone's breaking into your house at night. Like, wherever it is prescriptive, it is calling for God's people not to be vengeful and violent in the ways that the world is. When others, and again, the Freddy Krueger test, it's not really trying to outlaw anyone being a serial killer. That's not really the issue. It's God's people are encouraged to live out a different way when other people, ordinarily good, would resort to violence.
Right. Yeah.
There is instruction for God's people not to do that. And that then becomes the standard by which God judges his people throughout the history books. Judges and Joshua and Samuel, Kings, etc., is against that standard. And the prophets just come down hard on it.
Yeah. Yep.
So now we're kind of pivoting to the New Testament. I think we need to note that, the Bible world history didn't stop at the end of the last book of the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
A lot happened from what people typically regard as Old Testament times and the time of Jesus. And we're about to get into the teachings of Jesus. But we wanted to highlight a few things that have changed in the peoplehood of God's chosen ones, that bring about necessarily a different kind of posture in relation to violence. So we're just going to talk about a few of these things that have changed. And so when you get to the New Testament, there's just a different context.
Yeah.
So one of the classic examples of this is, Torah is giving instruction to a people who are going to own their own land. It's going to be God's land, but he's given it to them. So they're going to have geographic boundaries, which means there are going to be people who live outside of those boundaries who are land hungry and resource hungry and like to pillage and plunder nations that they think are, low-hanging fruit, easy prey.
Yep.
And there are laws in Torah about how do you deal with this. And Deuteronomy talks about, first of all, seek peace. Try to work it out.
Right.
But that situation has changed by the time you get to the New Testament. You want to unpack that a little bit, Sam?
Sure. Well, for one, they're conquered by another group of people, so it's not really their land anymore in the sense of them owning it. Someone else basically could walk up and say, "Hey, I have a friend, and he's going to live here now, and you got to find somewhere else to live." And so that started with the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then and the Greeks, and now the Romans.
Yeah.
And
Way to remember the Persians.
Yeah, I forgot the Persians last time. Yes, I did forget them.
Okay, I forgot about that.
I don't normally forget the Persians, but I forgot them last time.
How can you forget the 300?
The 300. They've been through a lot of overlords, though. That's just it. It's like, after the Babylonians, it's just like they kept getting folded into new empires. It's just like, we got somebody else in charge. Greeks come along, the Greeks are in charge now. Romans come along, it's just them. So, they just keep getting folded into new empires because it's like, we can't fight. We're just sitting here, and whoever's in charge, I guess we just got to live with it.
Well, and that's a key point is they don't have to defend their home anymore.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ideally, it's whoever's conquering them, which they don't like that, but at least there's some security may not be the right word, but that's part of, now that we dominate you, we're also going to have to protect you. So when these raiding hordes come, you don't, it's not like Minutemen coming together. It's like, Romans, could you send your centurions over here because we need some help? And so that's a big deal because they don't have to be responsible for that. Yeah. They don't have to even justify it in some sort of other way. It's like, well, it's not ours to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not like, this is not just happenstance. Like, it just happened to be that now they can't do anything about the invading hordes because it's their imperial overlords who are responsible for that. It's that God made it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, God gave them land, gave them responsibility, gave them an alternative way of dealing with would-be invading hordes, right? And wanted them to showcase how to be a peaceful people and to trust in God to be their offense and their defense. And then Israel, the story of the Old Testament history is Israel said, no, I don't like God's design for that. I don't want to be dependent upon him for my security, my offense, my defense. I want to rely on what the nations have, at least the successful ones. I want horses, I want chariots, I want military commanders, I want a standing army, and above all, I want a king to unite it all.
Yeah.
Right? And God's like, I'll give you that. And and Hosea says, God gave him a king in his anger and took him away in his wrath, right? God is the one who, he gave him that, and they failed.
Yep.
Yeah.
They failed at being strong like the nations. The kingship didn't save them. Their army and their commanders didn't save them. Their horses and chariots didn't save them. And so God's like, I'm going to do you a solid and take all of this away. And I'm reconfiguring you as a scattered diasporic people who are going to be scattered among the nations.
Yep.
Nations that you don't own, you don't govern. There's going to be other kings, other military commanders that are in charge, and those people where you live, they're not going to be your people. Your people are going to be the fellow Jews who were scattered among these multiple territories. And so Israel became a trans-territorial people with no physical land that is theirs to defend.
Yeah.
Or control or otherwise govern with force, carrot, or stick.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
They became aliens and exiles wherever they live.
Yeah.
And what happened? That began as God's initiative, not just because they weren't good at being strong like the nations, but that being strong like the nations wasn't compatible for the mission that God had in store for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that we as modern day Christians have to really pay attention to. Because Israel tried to play kind of both sides of the coin. We want to be God's chosen people. We want to be the special people, favored people with God, covenant relationship with God, kind of the 4 Ps that you talk about, Sam, people, place, purpose, and privilege. But we also want to be like the other nations. Give us a king like the other nations. Let us look like the other nations. They're trying to play both sides of it. And I think modern Christians still try to do that. Like, we're supposed to be this special people who present the world with this radically different alternative to what they're doing. But so many Christians are like, yeah, but we still kind of want to play the world's way, And for Israel, God's like, if you try to play both sides, you lose. You don't get 50-50 or anything like that. When you try to play it the world's way, you just end up losing. And modern Christians, I think we need to learn that lesson to say, we need to do it God's way and be 100% all in, committed to that, and not try to make the same mistake that Israel did of trying to have it both ways.
Yeah. And it's tricky in this context where they're aliens and strangers to get guidance from Torah on how to act.
Sure.
When the nation among whom you're living is going to war. Because Torah gives them instructions on, this is what you do to protect your land that the Lord your God has given you. Torah doesn't give any instruction on, this is what you're to do when other people's land is being threatened, whom you happen to be a guest on as God's scattered aliens and exiles.
Yeah.
There's just no instruction for that.
Yeah, I think you made a great point. I don't know if it's a exact parallel, but I think of like the framers of this nation. There are certain like laws in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in place, but it's a different time and place, right? That's why the whole thing, like the Second Amendment. Well, that was for them there. They didn't have like AR-15, So like the setting has changed somewhat, and so you got to figure out. So there's this principle in place, but what does that look like now, like when recontextualized? And that's a hard thing. You can't just go like one to one. Well, it says this, so we do this. Well, no, we're not. Like you said, we don't have that land. We don't have that expectation.
Do you guys have any? Because I'm just trying to think of extra biblical writings from, the first few centuries leading up to Jesus' time, Jewish writings, because Jewish men were conscripted into the army. It's not like they had some kind of free pass. The Romans would conscript people from all their conquered peoples to serve in their military. And so it's not like there were, weren't any Jews serving in the Roman army. There were young men, some of them maybe even volunteered, who knows, but, at the very least, some were certainly conscripted. If you're a big, strapping Jewish man, it's like you're going to come serve in the army now. What were the kinds of things that they wrestled with? I can't think of anything, but my memory is just failing me.
Well, the stories aren't told of those people, because those people would be the sellout Jews, right? I mean, those are the ones who ate the pork. Those are the ones who renounced their circumcision. Those are the ones that allied with the Roman Empire. Like, Torah is pretty specific. You do not make alliances with other nations. The strongest alliance you can possibly make with another nation, I mean, there's plenty about not intermarrying with them, but the strongest alliance you can make is to consider their nation your nation and to be willing to kill and die for them. Yeah. And that's just anti-Torah.
Yeah.
It makes me think of,
So if it's happening despite Torah and against Torah, and there are no heroes who do that.
Right. It makes me think of, like, in First Maccabees, it talks about the renegade Jews, who ate unclean foods and tried to undo the marks of circumcision and all that. And so I suppose those Jews who gave in and were forced to serve and did it would be considered renegades. Maybe they're right up there with the tax collectors or something like that.
Well, the Maccabean literature is kind of an example of that, because the Greeks have taken, this is when the Greeks, kind of ran Palestine. Yeah. Right. And there were Jews who were in cahoots with the Greeks. And so when you hear these brave stories of Judas Maccabeus and his family members going and wiping out these villages and wiping out these armies and taking control of the land, they're not wiping out the Greek Empire. No. They're wiping out the Jews who had defected to the other side and, and are tied to these Greek overlords, right, and local governors and commanders. It's actually going after their own people who had defected to the other side and are functioning as a branch of the of the Greek Empire.
Yeah.
So it happened,
Right.
but it's never valorized.
Yeah, I mean, the Maccabean literature talks about forced circumcisions. You find Jewish men who are not circumcised, and they forcibly circumcise them, whether they wanted it or not, because it's like, you're a Jew and you're going to live by Torah. I mean, and that's like there are a lot of big lessons that come out of the exilic period, but one of the big lessons is they learned their lesson. It's like, we need to be a people who are radically committed to God. And so it's not that every Jew thought that way, but the Jewish leadership certainly embraces that mentality. If you are a descendant of Abraham, you are going to be a Torah observant Jew, because we know that when we weren't, bad stuff happened to us. And so it's this radical new us versus the world mentality that the Jews have. And you are going to be, now again, not everybody did it, but that's how you get people like the Pharisees and the Essenes, who are like, this is what God wants from us, and so we're going to live that out.
Yeah. I think another dimension, another transformation that happened from Testament to Testament is the rise of the apocalyptic strand of Jewish imagination. Sure. Books like Daniel, books like the Enochian literature, they paint a picture of a world history that's kind of gone out of control. And so the ordinary Jewish view of history that you kind of read in Samuel Kings is kind of like, if God's people are doing well, God is blessing them, right? But as soon as God's people turn and go against the covenant, God fights against them and they start losing. But then God's people repent and they get on God's side again, and then he blesses them. And so it kind of looks like a mountain range, like it's up and down. And when they're doing well, good things are happening. When they're being unfaithful, bad things are happening. And so that pattern was established long enough, going back to the conquest, but you see it especially in the book of Judges and afterward. The well-being of God's people is tied to their faithfulness. And so, but you got to a time, especially of Greek persecution, where the Greeks have overrun the land, and God's people were powerless to do anything against it. Except there's one big difference. They couldn't really point to this big event where God's people were unfaithful, and God sent prophets to them and said, hey, if you don't turn things around, I'm going to send the Greeks, and they're going to punish you and come down on your people. That didn't happen. Like, so when you go back to Assyria, when Assyria came into the land, God sent prophets, right? Like Amos, Micah, Isaiah, to kind of warn them, turn around so the Assyrians don't have to be God's judgment against you. Yeah. He did it again with the Babylonians, and to a lesser extent, but also with the Persians. But the Greeks, there was no big Jewish apostasy and no big prophetic movement saying, you've got to stop doing this or else we're going to send the Greeks. The Greeks just came. Yeah. And at the time that they came, the Jews seemed to be new people, right? Not given as much to idolatry. They've embraced powerlessness in regard to nation states. They've turned to Torah, with a greater fever and intensity ever since the exile. And they didn't seem to have done anything wrong, and yet the bad guys are coming, and they're doing horrific things, and they destroyed the temple, and they martyred several people. Yeah. So out of this time came a new way of having to reckon with world history. The old explanation of we must have done something wrong, so God's punishing us, doesn't fit this circumstance.
Exactly.
And so you have the rise of an apocalyptic worldview. Yep. That this horrific thing is happening, and God's people aren't necessarily to blame for it happening, and things are going to get worse. And God's people have one right response: be radically faithful to Torah to the point of death. Things might get worse, but they will not continue indefinitely. God will have his vengeance, and he will turn things around. And so the martyrdom tradition rises as the kind of definition and shape of Jewish faithfulness. And you totally see this in the book of Daniel.
Yes.
Exactly.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, they're martyrs who were just trying to be faithful, where faithfulness doesn't bring rewards like the old days. It just brings punishment from the Greeks. And those are the people in chapter 12 of Daniel that are promised the resurrection. So you have this, be radically faithful till death. It's not going to be fair. Innocent people are going to die, but God will vindicate you, maybe after you die, on this earth, but certainly in the resurrection you'll be vindicated.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating transition between what constitutes success or victory, right? Whereas before it was, So as you're looking at, for example, the conquest, when God fights for them, they win, everything's great. But when Achan does his thing and they lose, God's against us. But now it's like, you're never going to win another battle. And in fact, when you die, then that's proof that God's on your side. It's just a weird sort of transition and just perspective of it all. And I mean, it was required because they were not going to win battles against the Greeks, and it's just not going to happen. They're nobodies. And so, like you said, they had to reconcile with this, like, we're in a different world and we're seeing God work differently. And they had to figure out, what does it mean to live faithfully? Because violence is not going to be the answer.
Yeah. And I think that really helps people understand what we're seeing in the New Testament. It's like, I think for a lot of people, they think that all these ideas just sort of emerged with Jesus or emerged with the early church. It's like, no, they're working within a context that has slowly been growing over a period of centuries. Because what you said, John, it's so important for people to realize that everything has shifted. Faithfulness no longer brings blessing. Faithfulness brings persecution and sometimes death. And that's just, in a lot of ways, that's just not like Torah. Torah tells us a different story. And again, it's not because God has changed or anything like that, but because now Israel is just in this radically different situation, a situation that, to a degree, if they trace it back far enough, is their own doing, because exile was God's response to their unfaithfulness. But they're now going, God, when are you going to fix this? They still expect to get back to Torah kind of days. And it may be in this world, maybe it's the resurrection world, we're not quite sure. Different writings reflect different expectations. But they're still looking forward to a time when God finally brings the ultimate corrective to the situation. And that's what they're looking forward to. And the New Testament doesn't actually contradict that. Jesus doesn't contradict it. The New Testament writers don't contradict it. They're like, nope, this is what it's like to be the people of God now. But God's got this new thing that's going to take it in a much better direction, at least. Some people see it as a better direction. So.
Yeah, I mean, far from saying that the New Testament doesn't contradict it, not far from it, but more than that, the New Testament is the fulfillment of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the message of the apocalyptic seers, the prophets, was, yes, the pattern of up and down has been broken because you've broken the covenant. Right? Your covenant arrangement with God of do good, he'll bless you, do bad, he'll curse you. Like, you kicked that can down the road in the wrong direction a long time ago. Yeah. And the nations are just having their way with the world. The next step is not this act of repentance on the part of Israel when God gives them Jerusalem back. Yeah. And things will be good. That's not the next step. Right. The next step is a dramatic inbreaking of world history of God. Yeah. He's going to intervene decisively and turn the pages of world history and usher in a whole new era in world history. That's where the apocalyptic writings left off, waiting for this dramatic divine intervention. So when Jesus comes on the scene and says, the time is come, the time is at hand, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the good news, he's saying, I am the one. This is the time. Now is the time where the old age under the dominion of the powers is going to be broken down and the new age of God's kingdom is beginning. That is the view of the New Testament. It is the apocalyptic worldview that Jesus is that divine inbreaking and this new way of life that breaks the cycle of the old covenant ups and downs. Right, Jesus brought a new covenant. Yes, right, and he brought a new way of thinking about land and territory and prosperity and economics. Like, he was remolding them in light of a revolution that is shaking the whole foundations of human history. Yeah, and so it's the ultimate fulfillment.
Yeah, and again, it's not a surprise. Jeremiah 31 was Jeremiah 31 to something. New covenant. We're going to make a new covenant. It's like, God said this centuries before Jesus. God's like, there's going to be a new covenant. And to me, this is what's really interesting about this, because it really is so in line with what we read in the Old Testament, because like Israel in some ways, I don't mean this totally literal, but in some ways, kind of a cloistered group, even though they did interact with the nations. You got caravans passing through their territory. There's like all this stuff that's happening where they're interacting with the other nations. But at the same time, there's a boundary. This is us and that's them. They're out there, we're in here. That's kind of how they view themselves. And now, because of the exile, they're dispersed through the world. And we have to be a people who we just have to live with foreigners all the time. They're just always a part of our life. And so you do have a dual existence, because within these Jewish communities in Babylon and Rome and all that kind of stuff, within their community, they're still kind of a cloistered people. This is how we do business with other Jews. This is how we interact with. Torah is still going to define our interactions with each other. But we have to do it in the context of not owning our land and all that kind of stuff and having to interact with these foreign powers. And the New Testament vision draws on that and says, yep, that's what it means to be a follower of God. You're going to have communities of people where you have your own rules that govern how you do life together. You're going to be a community who is defined by God's radical definitions that go counter to the world. But then you're going to walk out from that community and you're going to engage a world that's not always going to be friendly to you. Sometimes, sure, they might like you on a good day. And some days they're going to be really offended by your message and your lifestyle. And so the New Testament, the church is, and Jesus' message is, yep, that's the way it is. We've got this new element. Jesus takes us in new directions. I love talking about, Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel and all that. But in so many ways, it's just saying, I'm sticking with the plan. This is not a radical new plan in that it's totally different. No, a foundation has been laid that's going to define the people of God, that defined Israel in exile, and how the New Testament officers are like, yep, that's us. We are an exilic people who are trying to live out a radically different image that has been revealed to us by God.
Yeah. And this is where you get in every stream of the New Testament literature is this apocalyptic framework.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus spoke in apocalyptic terms, and, the big surprise is they thought he was going to come and everything was going to change all at once. Mm-hmm. He's like, no, actually, there's going to be a first coming and a second coming.
Right.
There's going to be a little twist in the plot that he's going to reveal.
Yep.
But even within that, when you hold up what is the normative approach of God's people, you see in the book of Hebrews, the author holding up the faithful ones of Israel, those who lived faithfully, and many of them, especially when you get toward the end of the Hall of Faith, right?
Yeah.
These are people who died for their faith. People who are martyrs are held up as the heroes in the Hall of Faith, held up as the heroes for the church. And of course, you get to Revelation, where, again, another apocalypse and another version of world history where it's the martyrs, the saints wearing white robes are the hero. And not only that, but the victor, the one who will bring victory to them, is a lamb who was slain.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you have this theme of martyrdom continues to be, it's kind of like the church is built on the foundation of the blood of the martyrs.
Yeah.
Not on the victory of the righteous people who are on the side of the good and outpower, outfight, outkill the bad guys. Right. It's those who lay down their lives for others who are raised and promised the resurrection life.
Yeah.
And they're the heroes of the story all throughout the New Testament. And so the suffering people of God who bear up against the oppressive powers of the world, they're the heroes in the book of James. They're the heroes in the book of 1 Peter. They're the heroes in the book of Revelation. They're the heroes in the book of Hebrews. They're the heroes in the book of Acts. That whole trajectory, right? is not the, and of course that wasn't the only show in town, like the apocalyptic martyr hero suffering route. There were the zealots who, we are right, therefore we're entitled to use might to bring down, the Goliath nations. And and Jesus rejected their plan, right? And he converted a bunch of them. And later on, instead of killing the Romans, they were killed at the hands of the Romans. And in so doing, spread the gospel. And so they could have taken the strategy of the Essenes, hide off in the desert and stay safe there, right? And wait till it blows over and they get an opportune time and then go in with the sword and subdue the bad guys. And he rejected that route. He could have gone the route of the Sadducees, right? Who said, if the Romans are going to be in charge for a while, we may as well join them, make strategic alliances, and gain favors for God's people, right? And gain a privileged status among the powers, not compromising too much of our values, but at the same time appealing to the imperial overlords to incur their favor and get certain perks and privileges for God's people. There is no model probably more accurately descriptive of American civil religion than the Sadducees.
Yeah.
Right? People are trying to get the church in the cahoots with the powers so that world history, as far as America is concerned, will go in a Christian direction.
Right.
That's a strategy Jesus faced, and it was the one he was least tempted by.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes you can see Jesus look like a zealot. Sometimes he looked like a Pharisee, which is why they came to talk to him all the time.
And why there were Pharisees in the early church, according to the book of Acts,
Yeah. He seldom looked like an Essene because he was always in the midst of things and in
Right,
trouble.
yeah.
But he never looked like a Sadducee. When he got a chance to talk to impressive powers like the Pilates of the world, the Caiaphas, the Jewish leaders who had influence, in public places, he did the least talking. Yeah. He's just kind of like,
I got nothing to say to you.
I didn't want to talk to you guys. You're playing a totally different game than me.
Right.
Yeah.
And you don't get which side God is on.
Yeah, exactly.
The New Testament picks up this apocalyptic strain at every level. And some of you are wondering, I just want to know what to do if some guy walks on the sidewalk and punches me in the face or breaks into my house. What the heck does all this have to do with that?
Right, yeah.
There is no passage in the New Testament about loving your enemy or praying for those who persecuted you or submitting to the government authorities that's not happening over against this backdrop that we're explaining.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you got to understand the cultural, social, political, economic situation that the early church found itself in to get a read on what the response is going to be. So yeah, we've kind of talked about things we probably weren't anticipating talking about right away. Thought it might be 5 or 10 minutes and ends up being almost 45 minutes here. But this is really important because that's their world. Okay, Jesus entered into that world. His apostles were living in that world, and not just the apostles, but the followers of Jesus over the course of that first century that we read about in the New Testament, where this is everyday life for them. Walking down the streets, whether it's Jerusalem or Corinth or Rome or wherever you go, this is what daily life is like for them. And so how are we going to respond to that world? How are we going to live out lives that, as we said earlier, give them a radically different vision, a vision that aligns with God and his original intention at creation? And that means sometimes you're going to suffer. Guess what? Happened to Jesus. It didn't happen to him, so it wouldn't happen to us. It happened to Jesus as an example to say, guess what? It's going to happen to you too. And that's how we reveal God's vision to the world.
Yeah, I think such a big part of Jesus' invitation to take up your cross and follow me is to say, join the revolution.
Yeah.
Like, leave behind identification of pleasing God by personal purity and isolation in the desert. Leave behind incurrent favor for God's people through strategic alliances with the Romans. Leave behind the desire to overthrow power and then gain power for yourself so you can have top-down power over others.
Yeah.
You need to die to that whole thing, and you need to join Jesus's revolution. Because when he said, take up my cross and follow me, he wasn't talking about Golgotha. Mm-hmm. Like that statement he said before he ever died on the cross.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, take up the cross meant something before it meant die on a cross.
Right.
And that's hard for some people to wrap their minds around. They see the cross, they always think, oh yeah, that's how Jesus died. It became a slogan long before his death, but it meant something. The cross of Rome wasn't the default way to kill a criminal.
Nope.
The cross of Rome meant this is the specific way that traitors against the Roman Empire meet their death.
Yeah.
This is the death of insurrectionists.
Yep. It's a very political thing.
Yeah, people who represent a different order than the prevailing political order. Those are the ones that get the cross. So for Jesus to say, take up your cross and following me, he's saying, join the revolution. Mm-hmm. Become an outsider to the powers and principalities of your day. Represent a different kingdom whose kingship and whose capital city is not in Rome or in Washington, D.C. or not in the Kremlin or anywhere else, right? But whose capital city is heaven, whose Lord is Jesus Christ, whose politics is the politics of Jesus Christ. Like, join a deviant way of life that's going to mean that you're going to be an outsider till you die.
Yeah,
you're not going to be one of the gang.
Yep.
And unless you've taken up your cross and chosen, I want to be an outsider for the rest of my life, to represent a kingdom that is counter to the kingdoms of the world, even the most respectable, honorable kingdoms of the world,
Yep.
even the best political party that has the most righteous laws. If you're not an outsider to them, you haven't quite taken up your cross and followed Jesus. And so the Sermon on the Mount is not going to make any sense to you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Until you've taken up your cross, you're not going to get any of these passages about turning the cheek. You're not going to get why he used a whip in the temple to drive out the animals. You're just not. You're going to miss all these passages.
Yeah.
Unless you join the revolution that is the kingdom of God that is breaking in, that is replacing the powers of this world that are passing away.
Amen. Well said. Love it. Love it.
So we never got to the New Testament.
We'll get there. we did a lot of throat clearing setup for the New Testament, but we'll get there next week. So, all right. Anything else to say before we wrap up then?
Nope.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us in this week's episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen
After class.